Hi, my name is Kevin Bonham, and this is the first in a series of short tutorials explaining how to use some basic features of Adobe Illustrator. I'm a scientist, and Illustrator is an amazing tool I've found for making cartoons for presentations, figures for manuscripts, or even entire posters for conferences. But it's also really intimidating at first, and there's a lot of features that we don't really need. Once you figure it out, though, it can save you a ton of time and make the presentation of your data easier, faster, and better looking than some other types of software. Hopefully, watching these videos will get you up and running quickly with the most useful features and a couple of really great shortcuts without you having to watch hours and hours of tutorials and 2 years of trial and error to figure it out like I have. So first up, we're just going to make and manipulate some simple shapes. And the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have this toolbar over here. Your workspace might look a little bit different, but all we need is going to be over here. And if you don't have this bar, you can't find it, go to Window and make sure that the Tools is checked here. And if it's not checked, you can see it might be missing. So go and check it, and then this toolbar should show up somewhere. And you can drag it over. You can move it to wherever you need it to be. So, whoops. Here we go. Okay, so I've created a new document. This is a 600 by 800 thing. It's about the dimensions of a PowerPoint slide, but it doesn't really matter. Just create a new document, whatever size, and we're going to make some shapes. So for that, we're going to need to use the Shape tool. And right now you can see that this icon is a rectangle tool, but if I click and drag out, I can take a number of different shapes, rectangles, rounded rectangles, ellipses, etc. So first, we're just going to make a rectangle, and this is similar to a lot of other software in that if you just click and drag, you can make a rectangle of any size and shape that you like. One useful shortcut to know is that if you press and hold the Shift key, you're going to be constrained to making a perfect square. So Shift is a keyboard shortcut that will modify a lot of different tools, and we'll get to those when we get to them. But when you're making a shape, if you click and hold Shift, you'll make a perfect square. The same is true if you're on the ellipse tool. If you hold Shift, you will be constrained to making a perfect circle. So that can help you make perfect shapes if that's what you want, or you can always stick to making elongated shapes or whatever you like. You may have noticed that unlike some other types of software, once you actually make your shape, you don't go immediately to the ability to then select that shape and manipulate it. If I click and drag again, I'm just going to keep making new ellipses or circles if I hold the Shift key. If I actually want to select and move these objects, I have to go back and select my selection tool. And this might seem a little bit irritating if you are used to something like PowerPoint, but it can actually be quite useful if you're making complex cartoons. You want to make a lot of different circles in a row. In PowerPoint, you have to keep going back and grabbing the circle tool, make another one, go back and grab the circle tool. With Illustrator, you can just make all the things you want and then go back and pick the selection tool. And it's really helpful to note that the selection tool also has a shortcut, and you can see it there in parentheses. It's the letter V. So that's, if you learn nothing else here, know that the keyboard shortcut for the selection tool is V. Anytime you're doing anything and you need to grab something, move it around, if you're on the circle tool or the rectangle tool and you want to grab something, keyboard shortcut V, now you can select things. And while we're on the topic, selection is pretty easy in Illustrator. You can click and drag over multiple objects. You can hold Shift to select extra items. You can also hold Shift and click to deselect items, and then move them around independently. You can also, when you have multiple objects selected, you can resize them all. This is fairly common for a lot of different software. Not particularly revolutionary, but it's useful to note. Another thing to know is, unlike PowerPoint or Keynote, you will select objects if you are even partially over them. So if you see here, I'm only partly over that rectangle, and it will still get selected. So this can be important if I'm trying to select this rectangle in this shape. If I click and drag over both of them, because part of my box is touching this ellipse, I'm going to grab that as well. So again, shift-click can deselect if you don't want to use it. It's also useful to note if you have an object selected or group of objects, if you mouse over to the edge of it, you get a little rotate tool here, so you can rotate this object. Again, holding shift will modify this action and constrain you to 45-degree angles, which can be super useful if you just want to flip something upside down or flip it 90 degrees. In addition, if you are resizing an object and you want to keep the proportions the same, you can click and drag on the side, but that will change the proportions of the shape. If you hold shift, you will be constrained to the same proportions, the same width to height ratio by holding the shift key. So all of those little shortcuts might not be obvious at first, but they can be super useful when creating shapes. So last thing we're going to talk about is making polygons. What I'm talking about will be true for Star Tool as well, but if we're making a polygon, if you just click and drag, you might see a different sided shape than I have. Right now I have an octagon being made, and you can see that I can have any sort of rotation. If I hold shift, it'll keep it in a sort of regular orientation. If I don't want a regular octagon, I have to go back to the selection tool again with the keyboard shortcut V, and I can manipulate the width to height ratio. Again, if I hold shift, it'll keep the same proportion. If you want a different sided shape, or if you have a different sided shape when you use the Polygon tool and you want an octagon, select that Polygon tool and then just click once, don't click and drag, and then you brings up a dialog box that allows you to pick the number of sides that you want your shape to have. To begin with, it will always be a regular shape, so if I do 3, it'll be an equilateral triangle, and then every time I use the Polygon tool after that, it's going to be more triangles. But again, if you just click, instead of clicking and dragging, you can select the number of shapes that you want. Go back to my selection tool and get rid of all these things with delete. So that's how to create and manipulate some simple shapes. Pretty straightforward. Future videos we'll talk about adding color, making more complex shapes, etc. But hopefully that is useful. Remember, V is your friend to always go back to the selection tool. All right, we'll see you in the next video.